Hi, welcome to the first episode of Little Victories of 2026, the video game podcast where we celebrate every small win. I am your host, AndresPlays. We kick off this year with a very fascinating conversation featuring Cara Ellison, a senior narrative designer and veteran in the gaming industry. Her previous works include Dishonored 2, God of War Ragnarok, and most recently, the critically acclaimed Ghost Town. Today's interview takes us through the arduous process of game development, what modern narratives can learn from each other, and designing better games. Please enjoy. Cara Ellison, thank you so much for being here. I was looking at your Wikipedia page, and I think you're the most recognized person that I've had on the Little Victories podcast so far.
Okay.
So you've written for TV and comics, books, journalism, right, for The Guardian as well. Also, the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, right? I love the Game Maker's Notebook. I love that podcast. It's incredible what they bring, to the gaming industry, all of the conversations and discussions that they have, beyond just, gaming and in every discipline, right? You go for stories, you go for audio, for the technical aspects of everything. So it's great that you're a part of that. Like I'm really really glad to have you here, and of course, congrats on being part of being selected as part of the BAFTA Breakthrough Program, right? Just last November, was it?
Yeah. So yeah, in November they it was just like a big surprise, like straight out the blue, just
Yeah.
hi, like you're part of this thing and it's like it's so cool. So I get to like be part of like, this group of amazing people who have all done really extraordinary things. So it's
Yes.
really amazing to be part of it.
Yeah, I was reading your interview on games industry that Bez read, and you mentioned that you've been working in the gaming industry for over 16 years, sorry.
Mm.
And I think it must be a little interesting to see, like, oh, you're part of a breakthrough, right, when you've been here for quite a while now already.
I mean, I think this program, though, specifically is for
Uh-huh.
people who might have been working really hard in the industry for a very long time, but are ready for like creative leadership. So it's almost like
Right, right.
you've been honing your craft, but it's like you're right on the cusp of like beginning to like actually go into a form of leadership, which I think is good to be recognized because it does take a lot of us a while to get there. Some people might be really lucky in that they get that when they're 20 or whatever. But a lot of
Mhm.
us would like to hone that craft for a bit longer. So I think that's why it's really helpful is going like, okay, now you've got to the top of your craft. Like, is there something else that you want to do? So we can help
Mhm.
you, think about what that might be. So yeah.
Of course. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, the breakthrough is be part of a mentorship now. Be a leader in the industry, which I mean, I'm
Yeah,
sure you've already
exactly.
become, or are
Exactly. It's
becoming.
much more about like using that craft to go somewhere rather than just establishing that you're there.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think is different from like, I used to get a lot of things like just as I was exiting the like games criticism, they would give me like a rising star award and I was like, oh, well, I'm not a rising star. I'm like leaving now. I've done everything I wanted, like it takes a little while for that to but yeah, this is not like a rising star program. It's more like you are ready for something bigger, I guess. So yeah.
Right. Well, that must be very exciting. And before we start the interview, of course, this started because of Ghost Town, really one of the most award-winning games of 2025. And I've been thinking a lot about. I think that you have games like Expedition 33, like Ghost Town, that I think that they are recognized and elevated by gamers because their writing is just so great. It's so tangible, it's so human, and I think it goes beyond just I think it's been quite my line, right? Writing in games, the whole
Yeah.
Joss Whedon kind of writing and stuff like that. And then you have games like this that you play them and you're like, somebody like Edith Penrose, right? This character, like this fantastical paranormal world, you really believe that it's real, right? It's just like a parallel world to ours or whatever, but it's still tangible.
Yeah. And I think what helps with that particularly is the setting because you don't really get that many sort of real world games. Like you do get like quite a lot of post-apocalyptic games, and you don't get, but you get a lot of like fantasy or sci-fi kind of games, and I often get tired with those kind of settings. I do want something that's much more urban fantasy kind of stuff where you use these mundane settings that we all are really familiar with to ground ourselves in, and
Hmm.
then put a layer of magic on top. And I really like
Yes.
that kind of aspect, right? Because it really, like you say, it makes you feel like you're there.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And that's such an incredible thing to say because, in Latin America, right, you have Gabriel Garcia Marquez, all of these writers, right, from Colombia and Mexico. And it's this genre, that originated in the 20th century, which was, magical realism, which is just
Yeah.
very mundane things, but are kind of elevated in some way. And I do think there's a lot of parallels with that in Ghost Town.
Exactly. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Marquez, and so I feel like I I took a lot from reading those kind of things when I was much younger, and really feel like video games are the next iteration of that kind of piece of fiction where we could go much further with magical realism than we have been. So
Hmm.
yeah, you're right. There is like such a massive link between Ghost Town and that kind of magical realism in that part of the world where they're really thinking about like, the everyday is also a form of magic, and you don't have to go too far um, to be able to believe in like extraordinary things, right? And so I think that's
Right.
why it's really cool to work on something particularly like Ghost Town.
Yeah, I mean, and you see it like you get. I would understand why game developers would want to go, into fantasy, right? Into something that you have never gone before, or a setting that you have never seen before, right? Or maybe even you worked on God of War Ragnarok as well, right? The Norse mythology setting, which has been used quite often by now. But I do think that there is a part that has not been fully explored, right? Because you get games, right? Yes, like I don't know, Grand Theft Auto, obviously, but that's just like extreme hyper realism, right? Not realism, with a tinge of magic and fiction attached to it. They either go
Yeah,
like hyper realistic, or to the other end, right? Which is
yeah.
complete fantasy.
Yeah, I mean, I think crime is an interesting genre in games because there's particular forms of crime stories, like in GTA, where
Hmm.
it is very realistic. But I do think there's like a little bit more that you can do with that kind of stuff. I think I'd like to see a bit more than like just shooting people to death. Sometimes I just wish our, games would do a little more than like shooting people to death kind of stuff. But yeah, like there's certainly like an interest there with like grittiness and realism. But like you say, like there's something else that you can use those mundane kind of settings for. And I think like
Hmm.
just pushing it a little bit further, I think is interesting to me.
Yes, it's there's been this kind of trend that's been going on social media that the way they describe it, they say video games. Most people just like shoot gun or play ball, right? Like those are the two genres,
Yeah.
which I do think it's I am a big indie advocate, right? Like I love indie games. I do think that they explore a lot of different things that you could do with the medium, right? I mean, you believe in that as well, and you see that I remember one of the first games that I really loved going into it, and thinking like, well, I haven't killed anything in this game, and that's making me feel good. Like I'm glad that there's other ways to engage with gaming, that it's just goes beyond you know yet killing something. Like I know it sounds silly, but it's the truth. Like we have been doing it for so many years that it just becomes second nature at this point, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's to do with the form of reward that you get for your interaction and paying attention in games, right? And so
Yeah.
I think there's a lot about it is I was talking to Martin Hollis a very long time ago. He made GoldenEye 64, and he worked for a really long time on these, amazing games. And he really regretted what he called, bringing violence to console games. Like, like that's what
Yeah.
he was kind of famous for.
Wow.
And he kind of regretted it. I think he spoke to Miyamoto once, and Miyamoto was like, it's
Hmm.
really disappointing that, all of the guards that you shoot in GoldenEye don't, you don't, it doesn't cut to like them waking up in the hospital bed and they're okay, like sort of stuff like that, which made me really laugh.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, like I think um, Martin Hollis was saying that like really shooting is really great in games because you press a button and there's an immediate visual reaction to something that you've done, and that feels
Hmm.
very rewarding, and it pings a particular part of your brain pleasure center where you're like, wow, that's amazing, like there's an amazing reaction to my just pressing a button, right? And so shooting in games has that like instantaneous feedback that makes you feel good. Whereas like obviously in real life that would make you feel terrible. And so there's a form or it should. And so I think there's a form of feedback there that, and then he went on to say that that because that is the way that it is, it has been iterated on so many times in games that it feels great now. So it started feeling good, but then it feels great now to do that because it's very simple to iterate on and has a really good kind of history in our game industry of people working on those games. What hasn't been iterated on is things like social situations,
Hmm.
relationships between NPCs. I mean, we obviously have had some work on NPC stuff, but it's not like you can have like a full blown, romantic relationship with a lot of NPCs because it's really awkward, and the way the bodies fit together is different, and
I
like
see.
animations are hard and all that kind of stuff. Hugging in video games is really difficult, right? So
Oof. Yeah.
yeah, so a lot of the things that are like more pleasant haven't been iterated on. But also, I think there are forms of things that are happening now in the indie sphere that are really
Hmm.
exciting, that are more reward based. Like, for example, the Metroid Brainiac thing that's happening right now is so fulfilling to me because the way that those games give feedback that, reward you. Um, Feels really good. A lot of it is like, you get like a little sting of some audio and then it completes and then it says, oh, you
Yeah.
got everything correct and solved the mystery. And this is really what happened. You've got that kind of Obra Dinn, like, I got everything correct. Ding. Now it's stored in your diary forever. And like those sort of things, they obviously take a little bit longer and they have more of an investment on them than pulling a trigger on a gun, but it
Yeah.
is also like really, it feels really good, right? And so I think there are other ways that we could be trying, and I do think that we can go further that way. So that I'm really optimistic about it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I do think that, looking back on last year, Blueprints, obviously, which is it's a game that iterated on the roguelike genre, and it does some puzzle and it does some intense narrative as well, but it's just like they weaved a very sprawling web, right? It was, and the developers said it themselves, this is not a game for everybody, this is for a very specific kind of
Mhm.
person, which of course, it really speaks a lot about, who will take the time to play these games, right? I sometimes like looking at the achievements when I finish a game on PlayStation, and it's a little disheartening, but I suppose that every developer kind of knows, right? Reaching room 46, for example, in Blueprints, it has like a 10 or 12% achievement rate, which is, like almost everybody dropped it at some point because they were frustrated.
Mhm.
And I get it, right? You have to be tenacious, you have to really love the mystery. And you talked about like rewards and how that, feels good for the brain. And in a game like that, to have it, because it's run based, of course, to have, let's say, 5 runs in a row and to not feel that you're making any progress, I can understand why somebody would drop it, right?
Yeah, and I do think that actually a little bit about Blueprints is that I think, I mean, it's hard for me to play a game these days and not think about it as a designer. Like, it's hard. I'm sure filmmakers watch
Yes,
movies and go, I wonder why they made that choice, or how did they set that up, or like, how did they get that effect, or like, I wonder how they did that, kind of stuff. And I feel
of
the same
course.
way about playing games as I go, like, would I make those choices myself? And I think for Blueprints, I think the RNG was a little bit of a sticking point for me because I do feel
Hmm.
like I would much rather have a very, I don't want a linear experience, but I do want something that's a little more refined towards the branch experience, like the experience of, like I don't enjoy, like you say, having 5 runs where I don't discover anything new, don't do anything new, don't get anywhere. And I
Hmm.
think that you can refine some of the ways that your game works so that it's more likely that you're going to find something new.
Yes.
And they probably do have some of that in there, and they probably have over time refined it into a better shape. But for me, I don't think the RNG adds that much to my experience. I actually think if it were a little more closed in terms of gating each of your parts of your experience in that house, I
Absolutely.
actually think it would be a better experience. However, a lot of developers don't have the luxury of spending, their like 10
Yeah.
years on making a game, right? So I think at the same time, you have to respect a developer's time and go, well, it's a great game. So why am I complaining? So there's a part of me that's just like, why am I saying shit about it? It's like, it is a wonderful game. It's a great idea. It's well made. I
Yeah.
enjoyed myself, like it was frustrating at a lot of points.
Hmm.
But just because I wouldn't make those choices doesn't mean that it's not great. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It reminds me of this sort of group of gamers, right? I see a lot of Steam often, and it's of course the people who are passionate enough to write a review, because a lot of people don't do that. Sometimes they do it, out of goodwill, and sometimes they're a little misguided, right? Because sometimes I see, thankfully I've been able to interview a number of developers, right? And then I see some comments from reviewers and gamers that they say, like, I don't know, I like the game, but if I was making it, I would
Mhm.
change this about the story and this about the gameplay and this, and it's like, I mean, I understand where the player's coming from, but like, you as a designer, like, you would never say that to anybody else. Maybe you would give, like,
No.
some positive feedback on, like, okay, this is your idea, this is how you could kind of refine it if you want, but like, you know
Yeah,
um
well, partly one of the reasons I say that you have to respect the developer and their choices is that
yes.
my experience, at least, has been, and I think many developers have this experience, which is that people will say stuff like, "I wouldn't have made that choice," or "I wouldn't have done this," or I wouldn't have done that,"
Hmm.
or like, "These features should be here," or whatever. The chances are that they did try to make those things or to
Yeah.
do those things in the game, and they found that it was either not fun, it didn't work, it was unshippable, um, or they didn't have time. And I think a finished work is so much more valuable than an unreleased work. And I keep saying this a lot to, like, especially to folks that I mentor. I'm like,
Hmm.
finish it first and then get mad at it later, right? Because you can
Yeah.
always change it once it's finished and you can see the shape of it. But you can't really see the shape of it until it's a full thing, right?
Yes.
And if you do have the time and the money, you can fiddle with it for as long as you like. But ultimately, the finishing of something is the most hard thing you'll do probably in your life, in your working life, right? And so
Yes.
the finished thing is worth so much more than you listening to the inner gamer in your brain and going, oh, it should have this or it should have that, right? And so that's, and also because I'm a narrative designer, finishing means that you have an ending to your story, and again, that's much more valuable than like a beginning and a middle and no ending.
Yeah,
So
100%.
you're
Yeah.
always like budgeting to finish the game because if you're not doing it, then you're going to look like a bad storyteller because there's not a good ending. There's no
Hmm.
budget for the ending, right? So you have to be planning. So yeah.
Yes, yeah, no, and I mean, of course, not to like badmouth any games, but I was watching a friend play, like, Mind's Eye, right? One of these games that was had a very storied, troubled development, right? And I remember, um the game simply just ended. Like, it was just very abrupt ending. I mean, and obviously, now that we know the reports, right, the developers, the mishandling, you could see that maybe that was one of the issues why, right, they probably didn't plan or ran out of budget or something that made them just be like, okay, have this sort of like last fight, rush last fight, and just roll credits. And of course, like, people will notice, obviously, that like, well, this does not feel rewarding in any way, right? Of course, there's video games that have like, I don't know, a bombastic boss fight, a heartfelt last scene or something, but to just cut it off like that, people will notice.
Yeah, and I think, I do have a lot of sympathy for folks who,
Yeah.
because of troubled development or because they don't have the ability or the power even sometimes to be able to like push development towards finishing or to make the choices that will lead to the game being finished in a way that like is satisfying. I have a lot of sympathy for those folks because it is really, really hard. It's one of those things where often in the narrative department, you don't actually, I think the outside view is that
Hmm.
you have the most power in the world because, Ken Levine is a game director and he tells stories, right? But it's like
Hmm.
Ken's power is very rare in the industry. He can stop production if he wants, he can say, no, I want to go this direction instead. But most narrative departments don't have that power. We sit, quite far below the other departments, and we're very much
Yeah.
a content department, which often is construed as being a service department rather than a leading department. And that often means that, like you don't really have so much power to be able to move the ship so that you go towards something that you need. And that's often for good reason, right? Like if the game mechanics are not fun, no one's going to play your game anyway. Like if it's just pure story, it's a visual novel, and like people are not, that's not like something that often people want in the game sphere, even though visual novels are fantastic and I love them.
I agree.
So, like it's one of those things where people are like, well, what's most important is this is fun. And I agree with them.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
but that also means that you have to start thinking about, okay, what resources are left for telling a story? And it's not often that much. So,
Yeah.
like it can be hard balancing those things. I have a lot of sympathy, maybe Mind's Eye, maybe it was like it wasn't coming together. So they didn't really think
Hmm.
that much about story.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And again, it was not to like, pick on a game that already had a lot of trouble, but it just came to mind. And there's several other games, um, throughout the years that you could see that maybe they didn't plan that far ahead, which is, it's something that I love seeing on Blue Sky. At least is, I think that because there's so much more elasticity, game developers, I believe, can speak more freely without any type of pushback, right, or hostility against random players, right? And that has brought to my attention some really sincere comments about like, "Ah, if I told you about how many projects I've never shipped, or the ideas that I thought, like, from narrative designers to to technical designers, they all talk about like things that were never shipped that they put their heart into for years. So it goes back to what you mentioned about like being able to deliver a product. It's extremely difficult.
Yeah, it is. And, especially if you're working in a larger company where there's a lot of people, sometimes communication is really hard. So,
Hmm.
there's hundreds and hundreds of people and like none of them know really what they're doing. Then you don't really have a video game, right? And so, especially you need a leadership who's like ridiculously communicative and all on the same page all the time. It's easier when you're working on an indie game, like Ghost Time, because the
Yeah.
team is not only really experienced and has worked with each other for a really long time, and who have worked out how to communicate with each other, but also like they're at the top of their game and they have all of the power in the world, right? There's only five of them or whatever, 10 of them in the studio. They don't have to make that much of an effort to communicate with each other because the numbers are small, and they know each
Mm.
other well, right? So I think, to me at least, um, once you get over about maybe like 70-ish people, communication starts to be like so much harder in your studio.
Yeah.
It was great working at Media Molecule on Dreams, for example, because at the time it was pretty
Yeah.
much like 50 people making a really big AAA video game. And you can imagine the workload was really big, but the sense of community was really amazing. So we got a lot done and the communication was great. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I saw that as well that you worked on Dreams. I loved what I've played of Dreams so far. And as I said, all of the games that you've been a part of, right? Even Dishonored 2, even if it was like as a consultant, like to have an influence in all of these games that I think have impacted the industry in one way or another is quite great. I wanted to ask you, now that you mentioned, Fireproof Studios, going on to the interview, and what a great conversation so far. Like I knew that, as an narrative designer, and me valuing video games so much, I knew that it was going to be an interesting conversation, because, like, you talked a little bit about, is the game fun, the game mechanics. And last year I interviewed Danny Waits, and he wrote the story, well, the dialogues of Harold Halibut, which is a very heartfelt game that I loved. And I know that some people really dropped it or didn't like it because it was slow, right? But for me, the writing was so great that I didn't mind it at all. But it's this fine line that you have to walk. Um,
Yeah. I mean, it's very hard, isn't it? I think for me, I've started to realize, so I'm a late in life ADD haver. So I was not
okay.
diagnosed with it until very late in my life. And one of the things I think that I mean, obviously you realize that, in many ways it's a disability, like, your cognitive processing is not the same as everyone else, but
Yeah.
I think one of the assets that it does give me is the ability to go, I've stopped paying attention here in my own video game. Why is that? I wonder why my attention is going somewhere else. And obviously, one of the things we are dealing with right now as well is that our phones are becoming addictive because people are using that kind of psychology to really reinforce that sort of cognitive brain pattern and that feedback on human brains. So it's very bad if you've got ADD, you can't get off your phone. However, if you think about that in terms of like how you keep people entertained and keep their attention,
Hmm.
sometimes I think about how could I write this so that the structure of it means that you are kind of experiencing novelty in ways that you might be surprised about, or is the minute to minute experience here kind of maintaining your attention? Um, and so I think that like when I do like smaller kind of story based games like Harold Halibut,
Hmm.
I'm often thinking about like, could I ask like, could I ask the art team to put something here or to like change the way the camera works? Or could I ask someone to like, support my work and like keeping player attention here, as well as obviously writing towards it.
Yes.
So I think with Harold Halibut, I think one of the things that they were working with, right, is that it's stop motion. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think that that is an incredibly difficult technical task.
Yeah.
And because you're working with this very rigid set of technical constraints, when I play it, I'm always thinking, oh my God, like none of the little levers I could have pulled to keep people's attention would be there for me. And that is so hard it's so hard to make anything that way. So
Yeah.
I can only salute them for making, this thing that like is like so difficult to make. I think it's such a feat of artistic like will. So
Hmm.
I think that game is really beautiful. I haven't
Yeah.
played very much of it, but I like
No,
love
it's
the
fine. Yeah, no, it's a slow burn of a game, right? And you really need to be in the mood for it. That's what I always say to people, right? It was one of my favorite games of 2024, but I am not gonna just sing its praises and be like, everybody has to play it, because I know that it's true. Even I review games as well, right? So I think it's I need to have the full attention of a game, right? And I have to play it, and I have to know what it's going for, and where the narrative is going, and the technical aspects of it, of course. But then sometimes I find myself, scrolling in my phone sometimes, I like the game has lost me for a second, and I have to remind myself to not be distracted by it, because I do think that it's just such a big time sink. The biggest enemy of I suppose a video game publisher is not like other video games. It's like people's phones. I think.
Yeah, yeah. Although I think honestly, games win quite a bit of the time against phones.
Yeah.
And I think it's, obviously because you're holding a controller, you're not holding a phone. So once you actually start up a game, it's a social experience also. So phones are not always a social experience these days.
Yeah.
Sometimes, it can be a hostile experience, in fact. Um, and I think games are much more likely these days to be a more social experience. And I think that's the positive of it, is that especially multiplayer games that are built for positive reinforcement between players, I feel like those
Hmm.
are really positive environments to be in. So I'm really interested in kind of serving that as a narrative designer. Like Dreams obviously didn't have a multiplayer element, but you could always see the creations that other people had made. So it felt social, it felt like you're having a
Yes.
conversation with other people, which
Yeah.
was really nice. Um, but yeah, like I definitely feel like there is a temptation, I think, to like do the thing that Netflix is now saying they're doing, which is essentially writing, repeating plot details and exposition all the way through your work so that people who are watching their phones will understand the plot. But it's just like, I don't know why you would do that, because not
Yeah.
only are you teaching people to not pay attention to your show that way, but you're also removing a lot of the craft and artistic kind of expression from what's actually happening on screen. Like you should
Hmm.
make a whole work. You can't be defensive when you make entertainment. You can't make like I learned this when I was doing game criticism. You
Yes.
can't like think about what all your detractors are going to say in the comments when you write an article, because all you're doing then is like pre-fighting a battle, and that makes the thing you're saying not interesting anymore. It's not like you're not saying something thrilling, you're not saying something interesting, you're not saying
Yeah.
something brave anymore. You're just saying like, I know you're all going to hate on me because I have this opinion about this game that you love. You can't go around making art that way or entertainment that way, because you'll lose the audience. Like it becomes a defensive piece of work, and no
Hmm.
one wants to see someone constantly defending themselves. It's unpleasant and it feels like kind of cagey and wrong.
Yeah.
Um, you want to see, it's thrilling watching someone really like go out of their comfort zone and try something really big. Like,
Yeah.
Blueprints is a thrilling piece of work because it's really like, it really aimed for something, right? But if you were making blueprints and thinking, oh, Kara's just going to hate the RNG, she's
Yeah.
just going to hate on it the entire time, and she's going to say I'm a bad game developer, it's like you're not going to,
Hmm.
not only are you not going to make it, but it's going to be less good work, right?
Hmm.
So I honestly, truly believe that you cannot write defensively. And I think things are a better piece of entertainment if you don't. If you just say what you need to say in the most entertaining way possible, people will come along, I think.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I do think that it's I don't know, you said several things there, but like I do remember Stranger Things. A friend got a little angry about that, but I was watching the last season and I just posted this because I was thinking like it just feels like this show is just a bunch of scenes of people explaining really simple stuff to each other, and I'm like, I already saw what was happening. Why are you frantically explaining it? And apparently I was not the only one who kind of really noticed that. And it's an alarming trend for me, right? Because I looked at the behind the scenes, and it really was this titanical effort of course, millions of dollars and sets and visual effects and everything, for it to be undercut by the idea of let's add this, for the people who might be scrolling on their phones. Like, no, like I don't know, I don't think James Cameron is doing the Avatar movies in that same sense.
I agree with you, and I think Spielberg, obviously they took a lot of inspiration from Spielberg for Stranger Things.
Yes.
And and I do think like one of the things I was thinking about a lot is that if Spielberg had made things that were that defensive, he wouldn't have made any movies. Because if you think about it, like Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? Everyone's big problem with that on the lore side, right? Is like, well,
Hmm.
if Indiana Jones had never been, even existed in the story, then the same plot would have happened, right? They would have opened the, arc, the same crap would have happened, right? And then at the end, the government takes the arc back to the archives, right? And like he might as well have never turned up, right?
Yeah.
But that's not the point of it, is it? Right? Like the
Exactly.
point of it is the story and the fact that you were along for the ride and you got to see all these amazing things and you got to feel the way he feels about it and you got to see the things he saw. That's the point of the movie. And Spielberg directed it in such a way that it felt like you were there and that you were along for that like experience, right?
Hmm.
And I think like that's probably the main reason why I think that you don't have to. I think the internet has really pressed us to look at plot and exposition as being a
Oh God. Yeah.
virtue.
Yes.
You
Yeah.
know, like where people maintain these big, like almost like Wikipedia style things of different tropes and like different aspects of plot and like libraries of how things fit together, especially in games. Like people are really excited about that sort of thing. But even though I'm a storyteller and world builder, I'm not excited about those things because it
Hmm.
doesn't really matter what I think about the world building. It only matters what the player experiences from the world. If it doesn't matter if it's not a kind of Disneyland experience. You know what I mean? Like they have to have that Disneyland experience. And like it
Yeah.
doesn't matter what the lore of Mickey Mouse is. If they're having a bad time,
Hmm.
yeah.
hmm Yeah, no, 100%. Like, and I think, going back to Ghost Town for a second, I think that the game is incredible. It does have this like unified paranormal world. Also, this great mix of having a sense of presence, right? It's a game made in VR, and then you have all of these really well built puzzles as well. But I do think I saw some of your comments, right? That somebody praised Edith Penrose, right? She you mentioned her as a goth witch exorcist, which is like, or a freelance witch, right? Which is like a brilliant description, right? I think it's amazing. Um, One of the things that I asked, Henry, my editor at Upload VR, was like, "Are there any jump scares?" And he said, like, "No, it is eerie, right? But just go into it, man. Like, just don't ask any questions. Just play it, and you're gonna love it." And lo and behold, I absolutely did. And I think it goes back to what you're saying, because both the character of Ida, that's so well developed and so like she's not kind of explaining herself to you as a
Mhm.
player. You kind of pick up on how her life has been
Mhm.
through her slight comments, through notes, through other people's
Yes.
uh, comments back to her. And
Her
I do
mom and
think
her
that's,
answering machine
oh
stuff.
yeah, the answering machine, yeah,
Yeah.
and the flyers right on the wall. And I think that, like, now more than ever, I think a lot of us who crave these kind of elevating experiences, we notice when they respect the
Yeah.
player, like, and I do not mean respect as in respect players time, but as in, I have somebody who has critical thinking, and you don't have to tell me her whole biography before the game starts.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is a rare example, maybe, of me walking the walk instead of talking the talk, because a lot of the time you are forced to do some, form of exposition in places that you don't want to. But
Hmm.
for Ghost Town, I was really, really adamant that I wasn't going to sit there and explain everything about the world, because one of the things that you want from, a thriller or a horror game is you really got to rein in that, like, that feeling like I want to tell everyone my life story, or like I want every NPC to be like constantly, explaining the world building. I'm just like, I am working with one of the most amazing teams in the world at atmosphere and world building. Like
Yes.
they already know how they can tell a story without any dialogue. So I don't need to go out there and like front like I'm trying to explain things to everyone. My job here is to maintain that Spielberg tension, right? Like all I'm doing here is restraining myself enough that players can feel unsettled but not scared. And that tightrope was on my mind all the time because the first thing you kind of want to do is you want the player to feel an emotional response to what they're looking at or doing.
Hmm.
And so the temptation is to make Edith afraid, right, of everything, and have her be upset, or like, you might hear her heartbeat, or you might like feel, her breath, or, like you might, like hear her heavy breathing or something. You might, that the temptation is there, right, to do that. But the team was like, we have a lot of players from the room who were conscious that we're making this for. And
Hmm.
they are not the sort of players who want to feel scared. What we want them to do is play to the end. We don't want them to like feel like something's going to jump out at them in the
Yeah.
next room, right? We don't want them to feel that way. We want them to feel confident that this is a puzzle game that they can play. But we want them to also feel immersed in the atmosphere. So it was a tightrope to walk. So my choice was to write Edith as if this was
Hmm.
all normal for her. Like, this is her job. She's here to do a job. She's not surprised that there's a ghost here. It's like, oh, great, like a ghost. Like, or,
Hmm.
when she gets to the lighthouse, she's like, oh, surprise, a ghost is here. Like, what a big, it's like, now I have this
Yeah.
problem to solve, right? And so writing her that way helps you, I think, as a player, feel a bit more comfortable that you have all the tools you need to solve the problem and you're not out of your depth in any way. And it was a way that I was trying to signal to players, hey, like, there aren't going to be any jump scares, And that's what they
Hmm.
wanted, right? They wanted that feeling of like, let's just solve some puzzles. So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's brilliant, and I do think that there's a fine line because there's puzzle games that kind of relay their narrative right through narration, right, their story through narration. But in this case, I do think that it's a fine line between some puzzles, and then you have either walking through halls, but seeing things, you're being possessed, or listening to whispers and voices, right, or eventually when you meet the warlock to have that conversation. I do think that if it was all puzzles and just the narrative set to the side, I don't think it would have been as impactful. So I'm glad that
Yeah.
there is a way that Ghost Town does so well, which is um, gives you room to breathe, right? Like there's some really tense sequences,
Mhm.
not a complete jump scare, but it's quite tense, right? Like you
Yep.
don't know what's gonna happen if it's the first time that you're playing, right? And then you meet Rena, right? Your very chipper and lively like roommate,
Yeah.
right? And she's like, everything okay? Like you seemed a little
Yeah.
strange last night.
Yeah, I love Rena. So Rena is like such a nice example of what we're talking about before, where
Hmm.
your flat is like this very mundane, kind of really recognizable kind of space. And then
Hmm.
you've also got Rena, who's like, she also is not very surprised that there's ghosts, and she knows everything there is to know about ghosts. In fact, like she's kind of like the Egon
Yeah.
Spangler character, right? Where she's just like, I'm making you a machine so you can see all the ghosts, like that kind of stuff. And so she's not surprised about any of these horrific things happening either, but she is
Hmm.
also kind of a normal person who's just like, would you like a sandwich? What's up? Would you like a cup of tea? Like she's kind of that person. And so because this is so normal for them, like it's really nice to write Rena because she's kind of a break from all of this like crazy supernatural stuff going on. She's really
Yeah.
just like, oh, like I wonder what you found out, kind of stuff. So Rena, yeah, she's a wonderful character to write as well because she's also kind of, she's like a like real London local. Like I know, like Edith's, parent, one of her parents is Irish. She's Irish, but she's living in London in a time in London where it was pretty difficult to be Irish because there are a lot of things going on during that time with the Irish and English government.
Hmm.
Um, but you've got Rena, who is like a London local who's lived there all her life, and like she's like through and through Londoner. And she's just like a wonderful character to write because she's just like so comfortable with everything. And Edith, secretly Edith has this like big
Hmm.
feeling in her where her brother is missing and she doesn't know what to do. So,
Yeah.
yeah, like she's such a wonderful character to write. Like,
I
yeah,
sorry. I just wanted to bring up what you mentioned, and I love that in games. Um, I there's this game that came out last year, Metroidvania, also called Pipistrello and the Cursed Yo-Yo, and it was made by a team from Brazil, right? And they add a bunch of stuff like soccer, which is big over there,
yeah,
and several little things that you can see that like they are grounded in their culture.
yes,
And something that I loved while playing Ghost Town, again, thanks to VR, and I also shared on social media, right, some pictures, and the game obviously looks beautiful, looks
yeah.
gorgeous, the graphics are incredible, and I remember some people saying like, "Oh, this is London, like some streets look the same as they do in the game, a
Yes,
little rundown, a
yeah.
little dirty."
Well, I mean, the developers live in Guildford, which is like just a train ride away. So, clearly they're close by. And, probably maybe a couple of them do actually live in London proper, but I'm sure like
Hmm.
they were really conscious that they wanted to get that correct. And
Yeah.
obviously, I think they were also, there's a big revival in our generation, at least, being like obsessed with brutalist architecture. There's a big revival in like brutalist sort of architecture, and like especially in games, we're all getting a little obsessed with concrete monstrosities, right? Weird mid-century buildings. Um, and so I think that there was like a kind of taste there for a little bit of like looking at those kind of things like high rises and that
Yeah.
sort of stuff. So we were pretty certain early on that we wanted her to live in this like, weird concrete sky, like, high rise
Yeah.
flat. So yeah, like it's definitely something where I think, everyone's so glad that like it's a familiar experience for a lot of people. Cause I mean, I think the other thing is there's a little form of territorialism going on as well, because I think British architecture doesn't get into games very often simply
Hmm.
because our setting is mostly futuristic America or some form of it, right?
Yeah.
Or medieval Europe, maybe like because of the fantasy Dungeons and Dragons. But there's never any like modern British architecture, and that's for many reasons. But I also think like I think they really wanted to get that in there, as a form of like cultural expression.
Yeah, and it's incredible that you mentioned brutalism because I was playing this game, Viewfinder. It's a small
Yeah.
puzzle game, and there's also a lot of brutalism in there.
Yes.
Juxtaposed, right, with the more artistic parts of the game, right?
Mhm.
And I don't know. I mean, that game also talks a little bit about what is climate change and stuff like that. But it's
Mhm.
interesting to see some sort of pattern, right, of a new generation of game developers kind of add that into their games.
Yeah. I think also there's just this renewed interest in architecture because maybe there's a little bit of fear in our generation about how static things are or how built to last they are, right? And the
Hmm.
ways that people would spend, huge amounts of money getting like stone brought in from some place in like, Europe or whatever to build this like
Yeah.
giant building. And now we like try and build buildings out of the cheapest materials possible and they like fall down in an
Yes.
earthquake,
Oh
right?
God.
So yeah, and in Japan, I lived in Japan for 2.5 years, and they build buildings that are easily collapsible in an earthquake, so that they can be rebuilt really easily and cheaply. So they build in a different way there than we
Wow.
do. So yeah,
Yeah.
there's a lot there. So I think that anxiety is coming out
Hmm.
in a lot of us now, where we're looking at these like big concrete buildings and thinking like, wow, actually, I appreciate them more now than I ever did because they look quite solid and like they're built to last, even if they're not. So yeah.
Yeah, no, it's oh my God, that is just incredible. Like it's true. My like literally just yesterday I was talking with a nun. She lives in Texas, right in the US. And she was saying that, her house was built in the 1970s. The house that she's living there now. And she does talk about like the cabinets, the foundation, everything does feel way sturdier, right, than most of the apartment complexes or areas that they make nowadays. And
Yeah.
it is a fear, right, to be like, well, nothing is built to last nowadays. I mean, I
Mhm.
know there's like this sort of ephemeral feeling, right, that I don't know, that the world is a little more fickle than ever, but
Yeah.
to have it also be reflected in our architecture is a fascinating point that I didn't think we would arrive today.
Yeah. And, like a lot of these buildings in London are sort of widely hated or derided because they are quite ugly and like gray and like they're not as
Yeah.
beautiful as, like anything in Westminster where they built it for the British Empire when they had out all the gold and they were stealing people's stuff, and
Hmm.
colonizing everything.
Yeah.
They built all these buildings made out of these stolen riches, and then you've got these like kind of 1960s poverty buildings where they're, like gross and gray and like, but they are still
Hmm.
so interesting, like until recently, my friend lived in the Barbican Centre, in London, and that's like a
Hmm.
brutalist masterpiece basically. And now everyone can't get enough of that building. All my friends want to move there, so
Yeah.
yeah, I think about that a lot where I think like you get to appreciate these things that, I mean, I guess one of the virtues of art is that something that is really not for one person can really be for another person, like people have to love it to
Yeah.
really get it.
Yeah, no, and of course, there's so much that can be said about architecture and well-built architecture. I just mentioned, the historical context of Ghost Town, but also the undercurrents of why certain architecture is made a certain way or made in a certain period of time, as you just mentioned.
Yeah,
Um,
I think as well, like there's a lot about particular forms of architecture that are like secretive or seem like they're concealing things. Like
mhm.
I think Ghost Town in particular uses those locations a lot, right? You can probably think of a lot of the places that we use as seeming like they're concealing something. I mean,
Mhm.
obviously, there's like the guy's mansion is obviously like it's just his house, but
Yeah.
you've got like the lighthouse where this like seemingly normal on the face of it old lady lives next to this like lighthouse,
Yeah.
but actually like her lair is like this underground like decryption like station, where she worked for the MOD. And then you've got like yeah, like obviously Edith's flat is something that looks
Mhm.
mundane on the outside, but it's concealing something wonderful on the inside. And like, there's a lot of that going on, I think, in Ghost Town, especially where, there's this idea that like there's something underneath that is kind of covering up how
Mhm.
interesting it is. I think recently, so in Dundee, near Dundee, we have one of the only nuclear fallout observations bunkers that is like left in the UK. And that was from the Cold War when they were like, well, if there's ever a nuke that lands in the UK, we'll have to monitor the fallout so that we can actually go around it and get like supplies around the fallout and not
Mhm.
get it contaminated. And so they knew that like they had to do that, but also they knew that anyone who was stuck down there was likely going to die. So they
Wow.
had to make all of these, but that is a piece of brutalist architecture. So that's like a concrete bunker with like this
Mhm.
little like radiation monitor on top of it. And it's like got this like giant kind of warren underneath with bunk beds and like little tea making stations and stuff you can see. And
Wow.
then obviously they didn't want to use any electricity because there could have been EMP effects. So
Mm. Mhm.
they had all this like analog chart like so they'd have like those big um plastic see-through plastic sheets with a number grid on it, and they would have like the outline of the UK, and then they'd plot the wind and like fallout from the wind and stuff like that on it in pen on these things because they couldn't use
Wow.
digital. um so I think about like lots of
Was
weird British
this made
architecture.
during the Cold War, or when was this made?
Yeah, it was made in the Cold War, and I actually do think it was made like quite early in the Cold War. Like
Uh-huh.
as soon as like Hitler was done, they were like, "Oh, well, we're in the middle of another kind of thing," and so they had they had some bunkers and stuff from the war that they were reusing, but in the end, because they recognized the nuclear threat, they started thinking about how they were going to make concrete that could basically fend off
Uh-huh.
radiation. And so they started making all these little things, and
Uh-huh.
they're all over the country, but this is the only one that's left working, and you can
Wow.
go
Yeah.
down.
You reminded me so much. When I review a game, right? I'm sure you did something similar. Like I would like to do some research. I like to do some research about what the game is. Of course, if there is something to explore, right? Some games are more straightforward than others. But there was this game that came out last year, Atomfall, that was
Yes.
based in the UK, right? And it was loosely based on the wind scale nuclear event that happened, right? That it could have gone much worse, but thankfully it didn't. And something that I really liked about the game, again, it was just so how grounded was, in its British
Yeah.
influences, right? One of the items that you could scavenge and it was all over, it was basically, tea.
Yeah.
You had a lot of so, and going back to what you mentioned, on Ghost Town, I think that as gamers, right, as people who love, finding a secret behind the waterfall kind of thing, games like Assassin's Creed, right, where you go to a cathedral and then you move this cross and then like a secret area appears, right? And then you have, of course, on Ghost Town, you have when Edith goes to the subway, right? And then there's this whole mausoleum, right, which
Mhm.
is obviously something that you can explore, again, urban realism, and there's something quite magical about that.
Yeah, and I think about that a lot. I think that's actually why I like urban fantasy so much, right? Is that you can take a location that you yourself are familiar with or like could be familiar with. You could something like a train station that you've been to 100 times, but then you can also like imagine that there's something secret behind like one of the
Yeah.
pillars, right? And so I think there's something really amazing about how you can take this familiar architecture and then really twist it and make it into something else. And like, I just think that that is so underused. Like, I wish that we could do more of it. I think,
Hmm.
I think that, we're so obsessed with the idea of, I guess Dungeons and Dragons really lives in a lot of our brains because we grew up with that form of, fantasy.
Yes.
But also there's like an element of sci-fi games because it is actually quite easy to make sci-fi architecture because it's normally we think of it as being very
Hmm.
regular, like it's very kind of straight lines and like can be replicated, and it's very kind of symmetrical and very like uses a lot of these like lines that actually when you're making sci-fi architecture it's much easier as like an environment artist because you can basically duplicate it and it looks like it all fits in like Lego,
Hmm.
right? Whereas especially medieval architecture, a little harder to do because it's so organic and it's made higgledy piggledy, it's irregular, it's weird sizes, it's not like
Yeah.
straight, like, and so it's actually a bit harder to make a fantasy game a lot of the time because it's harder to make it look kind of organically made by people who didn't have rulers, so um, but
Yeah.
I guess they did have rulers, but you know what I mean. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah. Yeah.
there's kind of a sense of like, one genre like sci-fi is like a little bit more popular because it's a little bit easier to kind of make that architecture. And plus you're not adhering to realism at all because you don't have to go, oh, this feels like something a house, because houses don't have to exist in the same way in the future. So
Hmm.
yeah, I think about it in terms of, utility of making things. Like I think if it's real and lots of people are familiar with it, it's actually harder to make it in a game, I guess. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely. Like, there's so many things, and I love, now that you as a senior narrative designer, you have all of these elements that you already know about, all of this experience that going into any sort of project. I remember looking at your website, which is incredible as well. but like looking at what you can do, right? You can set it yourself, like from the get-go. You can help build the world, or you can arrive midway and try to, fix technical aspects or add more to the world building. And I suppose that because you've seen projects in every step of the way, you kind of know what area specifically needs more help than others, I suppose.
Yeah, and actually, as I've got more experience, I think it's got a lot easier to be in that role where you do come in the midway, because it used to be that I would come in at the
Hmm.
end and it was kind of a disaster already or something, and they hadn't really
Yeah.
thought about the story, and then you just have to kind of do your best. But even now, when I come in like midway-ish, I actually think it's becoming easier for me as someone who's a bit more experienced now to go, oh,
Hmm.
actually, it seems to me like this is the kind of story you're telling, and this is the easiest way to get there. Here are my recommendations. And that's actually quite a pleasant job, because a lot of the time when you're a game developer who's been looking at the same materials for maybe a couple of years already, it's really hard to sometimes see a tree for the forest, if you see what I mean. Like it's hard to, or the
Hmm.
forest for the trees, sorry. Like you're not seeing like what the whole of it could be. Um, you're only
Yeah.
seeing like the tiny details, and you can't connect them together. And so when an outsider comes in, it's a bit easier to go, oh, I think the player experience would be this if this is what you want to say. And then here's how I would do it. And the other thing that's getting easier is narrative is all about budget, which I said before. Like, it's like, do you have the resources to make another character? If you don't, then you have to use the
Hmm.
characters you've got. And then that can be a puzzle that you figure out in your brain.
Yeah.
And so it's all, yeah, it's all about budget. So you basically, a lot of the times, the question that is pitched to you is, we don't have time to make A, B, and C. What can we make with what we've got? And that is like such a thrilling question to get as someone who's been doing this for a long time, because
Hmm.
it is so intellectually interesting to me to be able to figure that out for you. And I get asked to do that a lot now, and it's so rewarding for me personally, because I think that people don't realize that they aren't naturally writers or storytellers. I mean, a lot of game developers are naturally storytellers, but they don't have an idea of story structure or how to write characters.
Hmm.
So it could be really rewarding and fulfilling to get invited into that team to kind of just fill that like kind of void where
Yeah,
they
like
don't know.
bridge, from the concept to a fully realized idea.
Yeah, because they
Hmm.
kind of know what they want to get at, and they have all these references. They're like, oh, we kind of want to make this kind of story and this kind of narrative genre. Like, what do you think? How can we get there? And I'm just like, oh, this is so much easier than you think. But then to them, it's not easy at all, right? And so
Hmm.
to me, what's fun and easy is not to them, and it feels like a gift that I can sort of give that, like, to them. And really just exciting. And so I think I do honestly feel like this is one of the best jobs, because once you get to a certain level of experience and craft, it's just all problem solving, which I guess game developers love problem solving anyway. So yeah.
Yeah, that's part of what gravitated them towards doing
Yeah.
this type of work, right? This is what we want to do. How do we get there?
Hmm.
This has been an absolutely incredible chat. I think the most free form of all, and I think that's what I've loved the most. Um, because I always have a set of questions, but to actually just go with the flow and just pick up from ideas that we've said, and then jumping from that to different ideas and going back to things that we've mentioned. It's just been an absolute delight. Thank you so much, Cara. I just wanted to ask you one last question. Now, as as being selected of the BAFTA Breakthrough Program as well, you mentioned it right now in your leadership mentor role. If you had any, advice for aspiring narrative designers, storytellers that you'd like to give.
Yeah. I guess it depends on whether you want to write or you want to design. Like, do you know if you're on either side of that kind of are you much more of a designer? Like, are you more structural, more implementation in games? Or are you like much more of a like I really like words and the craft of words? Because I think you can definitely go deep on both. I was one side once and then kind of went way over to the other side. And now I do probably 70% narrative design and maybe a little writing on the side. And so
Hmm.
I think it really depends on what you're interested in. But I would say that if you're really interested in writing specifically and, writing what characters say, you should go really deep on the craft of writing. Like you have to practice a lot of writing, and um, I think I would really recommend my friend Hannah Nicklin's Writing for Games book for that particular thing, where it's specifically about writing as a craft, specifically for games.
Hmm.
And it really is just practice and also like showing your work, getting feedback from people, and making little prototypes yourself in Twine and things like that. And then on the other side, narrative design is a lot more like level design. So I would say get some experience in things like modding, because I think modding is actually going to help you figure out like the space you have, the characters you have, like what stories you could tell in there, how it all fits together, like what story delivery methods you want to use. Like, are you going
Yeah.
to use a text box? Are you going to get voices? Are you, that kind of stuff. So I think there's a lot there where it's like it really depends on like which side you're on and what you find most interesting, I think. So yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, the behind the scenes aspect of it, and of course, Hannah Nicklin. I've seen her on Blue Sky. I believe I follow her already. But yes, I'm gonna get that book myself. I mean, I'm a games journalist, but there's always quite an interest. An interest,
Yeah.
and I mean, because that's what great writing does. I saw in your games industry best that like you don't want to get stuck in a rut, and I do
Mm.
think that all great artists as yourself, I do think that like there's this idea of like you want to explore new things, and you always want to have that spark
Yeah.
of creativity keep you driving forward. And for me at least, reading this book by Hannah, I suppose it's really gonna reignite my love for writing as
I
well as
find that,
craft.
yeah, I find reading books about writing craft are really rewarding for me personally. It gives me
Hmm.
that motivation to keep going. And like you say, like you get rusty if you don't push yourself into a new area or practice something new.
Hmm.
And you're always learning and improving. So I feel like, yeah, I love, I know it's kind of a cliche, but I love Stephen King's On Writing. I think it's the only Stephen King book that I like. um, but
Right.
it's a really good book. I really love that book, and I really love Hannah's book on games writing,
Hmm.
and I do think you'll get a lot of motivation from them because it makes you feel like, okay, I'm in the mindset to write now. So yeah.
Excellent, excellent. Well, yeah, I don't want to take any much more time from you. I'm really excited to keep following your career. You're working with Gravity well now.
Right.
I'm still, still haven't announced, right, what's what you're working on. So
No,
I'll keep an eye out for that.
I'm hoping soon we'll say something, but I honestly
Hmm.
feel like it's such a lovely team to work with. I'm really enjoying myself. Yeah, it's really great to work there. And a really nice, yeah, like a really nice team and place to work. So I'm very lucky, basically. I think,
Great.
it's hard to find a team that you love and that you want to stay with. And I also think, I also work with like little smaller side projects as well that also like are some of the best people. So I'm just really
Hmm.
lucky.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, and I mean, as I said, well, I'm excited to follow your career, and to have more of your projects come out into the world, just like Ghost Town did, and so many people fell in love with it, right? I mean, even the ending of Ghost Town alluded to something more, which I'm sure we can't talk about, but whatever happens in any way, shape, or form.
Oh, I would love for another ghost town to happen. So we'll see. But I think the best thing to do is send messages to the fireproof guys. Be like, we want another ghost town. We want it
Okay.
to be bigger. We want it to be more story. Like, I think you should ask them.
All right, perfect. Yes, yeah, the world building. It all goes back to the world building is so believable that I'd
Yeah.
love to see more stories in that world. But anyway, thank you for such an incredible chat and for sharing your knowledge, Cara. And yeah, thanks for such a great conversation.
Thank you. It was lovely to chat.
Thank you so much to Cara Ellison for this thought provoking conversation and to you for listening. If you'd like to continue the conversation, you're welcome to join our Little Victories Discord server, which you can find in the description down below. I have so much planned for the rest of the year, so please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing to be a part of it. See you in the next one.